So Sarah, glad to have you here. Let's jump right into this. I want to start this way. What would you say are 2 or 3 myths about the white evangelical church that are often framed in mainstream media that people really don't quite understand and get?
I mean, I'm not sure if there are myths per se that are asserted. I think it's more, but I do think there are things that people don't understand. I think that often there's a misconception, first of all, just broadly, that evangelicals are all the same. And I'm glad you said white evangelical. That is the subtitle of my book, because I think it's really important to be specific about what we're talking about. And, you know, the differences, you can have 2 churches that have very similar theology on paper, but if the racial composition is very different, people are going to prioritize very different things when they go to the voting booth. And so that's why so often in the media, when we hear about evangelicals, we're really talking about white evangelical voters. So that's one piece of it. I think when it comes to evangelicalism as a whole, though, I think people don't realize many times what a large group of people we're talking about. And evangelicalism is notoriously hard to define, and the definition is contested. But, you know, generally when we're talking about evangelicals in the press, we are talking about both a political and a theological group. And within that group, there are millions of people who, you know, some of whom hold very different theological beliefs. They exist along a spectrum of beliefs. And, you know, once again, the politics tend to be pretty divided by race.
See, the reason I wanted to start there is because you're right. One of the biggest problems that I have with mainstream media, and I'm going to call it mainstream white media, is that they don't want to make that distinction. So what you will often have is, President Biden meets with black clergy, meets with a group of black ministers. But they'll never say Donald Trump meets with a group of white ministers. And what you have in this country, where people love to talk about identity politics. But when they talk about identity politics, they often are talking about, black people, Latinos, women, LGBTQ, but they don't want to see whiteness as an identity. And the reality is, it is. And it has always been that.
Right. And of course, it's an identity that has shifted and evolved, and who was included in whiteness is different, you know, in the past than it is today. It's something that, you know, arguably groups have kind of competed for because of white supremacy. You know, I descend from Italians, among others, and that's one of many groups that are now considered white that weren't when they first immigrated here. I just make that point to say that, you know, it's an identity, but it's also a contested identity, but it's one that shapes, it's an important category that shapes the way, you know, not just people think and vote and what they prioritize, but often who they associate with. And I think it definitely shapes our theology to a large degree, too. So you're right. When people talk about often about Republican politicians meeting with pastors, meeting with evangelical leaders, usually, you know, there might be a few people of color mixed into those groups, but very often when you're talking about conservative politics, it's a predominantly white group. And I think it's important, you know, not to gloss over that reality.
I often remind people of this here when we talk about white evangelicals, and I love when people are always talking about loving Jesus and Jesus is the model. And I remind them when I think it was Bob Riley was the governor of Alabama, and he wanted to change the tax code because in Alabama they were taxing people beginning at $4,600. And he said, that's crazy that we're taxing poor people at that level. And so he literally used Jesus as the model in the campaign, and went around the state and was talking about the importance of the poor and going on and on and on. Yet when it came to voting time, it lost 65-35. And guess what? All those Jesus-loving white evangelicals who say they love the Bible and they follow it to the T, they voted for their white pocketbooks and not for Jesus. And I use that because this is why I'm always talking about the fallacy of folks who run around and they're swinging their Bibles and they're talking about, moral standing or whatever. And I'm going, come on now, you're playing games with the Bible because you're putting your ideology, frankly, before your faith. And they try to mix those two together. And I use that example all the time because it was a perfect example of a white evangelical, conservative Republican using the language they often talk about, but they did not vote according to their Bible. They voted according to their pocketbook.
You know, it's interesting. So, as someone who covers politics, I've done a number of stories over the years about how people talk about faith in political spaces. And I think there are really interesting debates about that. You know, first of all, there's a question, should we talk about faith? And if so, how? You know, and I think it's a difficult one for a lot of people across the political spectrum in a society that, you know, by its very founding, is intended to value separation of church and state, right, and create space for religious pluralism for people with multiple religions, different religions, or no religion whatsoever. But the reality is that many people do talk about their faith and their values when they talk about how they vote and the kinds of issues they prioritize. And so it's interesting to hear how that kind of language is infused into, you know, so many different issues. And, you know, I tend to feel like sometimes it's a Rorschach test. You know, I mean, people think that Jesus would have voted for whoever they want to vote for. They think that Jesus would prioritize the issues they prioritize. But you're right. I mean, the Bible talks a lot. Jesus talks a lot about in the Bible about feeding the poor and healing the sick and helping the needy. And in fact, one of my, you know, favorite passages, there are a couple of passages where Jesus talks about the afterlife and sort of, you know, separating the sheep from the goats, the good and the bad. And, you know, in those contexts, very often he's talking about the people who land on the right side of that are the people who helped those in need. Now, you know, how does that translate into public policy? I mean, that's not for me as a journalist to say. And I think, you know, I've heard a number of, you know, people of faith of a variety of political persuasions argue about that. And I think people can come to different conclusions and do come to different conclusions. But it is fascinating to see how that religious rhetoric is employed for a lot of different purposes.
Take us inside a white evangelical church in terms of, I mean, look, I mean, I'm African-American, born and raised Catholic. I later joined a Baptist church, and we often see comedians make jokes about how different we are. Dr. King always talked about the most segregated hour in America is 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and so for you growing up in that world, what was it like?
Yeah, you know, the vast majority of my religious spaces, the vast majority of people in them were white. So the two most formative religious spaces in my childhood were my church and my Christian school, and they were separate from one another. So the Christian school I went to was operated by a church, but not the one that I attended. And when I said earlier that evangelicalism is, you know, a large movement, a large group of people, and includes a lot of different people across the spectrum, I mean, I think those two institutions are a good example of that. So my church was much more charismatic, expressive worship, raising your hands, closing your eyes. Some people spoke in tongues. Some people believed in gifts of healing, that you could lay your hands on someone and they would maybe be healed directly by God. My school wasn't into that stuff so much. It was a little more kind of buttoned down, a little more traditional, a little more towards the fundamentalist end of the spectrum, in the sense that girls had to wear dresses every day. I think people were, you know, just a little more, it would maybe be more like a Baptist kind of expression of worship, although it was also an independent church and school. But in those spaces, most people were white. And you know, what that meant was there were a few people of color in my class, you know, and I've talked to some of my former classmates and schoolmates, you know, since then. And some of them, I think, have talked to me about having some difficult experiences in that environment. Some of them I'm not at liberty to share, but one friend reached out to me recently after the book came out and told me some of the things he'd experienced in our Christian school that I just had no idea, you know, kind of overt racism and so forth because of his heritage. And, I don't want to say that that was commonplace or endorsed. That wasn't my impression, but at the same time, there were moments which, one of which I believe I describe in the book, where a girl in my class during prayer requests openly expressed that she didn't want Black people moving into her neighborhood. And I just remember, knowing that that was wrong. My parents had taught me that that was wrong. And yet I don't remember much of a response from the teacher. I think she just was kind of uncomfortable and kind of moved the conversation along. But, it was just kind of, I think it was baked into the culture maybe more than I even realized then. At the same time, and my church was also predominantly white, but not exclusively white. And at the same time, I heard a lot of good messages about race. I heard like the explicit messages that my parents taught me were that people were all made in God's image, that we were all, sons and daughters, children of God, and God loved us all. Skin color didn't matter. And that racism was wrong, and that the civil rights movement was a good thing, so I'm grateful I was taught all of those things. And I think those ideas really helped form the way I try to look at people. But what I didn't have was a lot of exposure to people living, in my community who had different life experiences, different backgrounds. And that's, to an extent, that's just how life is. Many of us sort of grow up in our community and it is what it is. Well, but I think
that's because people have to recognize that our communities, when we understand community in America, we have to understand that community is defined by neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are defined by income. Right. Income in America has largely been defined by race. And it's always amazing to me when I'm talking to people, they don't understand the intersectionality of those things. And the fact of the matter is, we tend to go to churches that are in our neighborhoods. Well, the neighborhood is going to look like it looks because of the folks who live there. And there are very few truly racially integrated communities. And then even if you have a racially integrated community, it is driven by income.
Yeah.
And that income typically is also determining ideology and political preferences and policy.
Yeah, very often true. And I think, while we actually drove across town to go to my church and my school, I do think it was, class comes into it, race comes into it. And I think what I didn't understand also is just how much history goes into that, right? I mean, I didn't know growing up that there was a tradition of, that the Black church had grown out of a completely different experience and in response to racism and often, exclusion by white churches, in some cases, overt racism and exclusion in the case of the Southern Baptist Convention, which, of course, as we know, the SBC later apologized for that history. But that is, opposition to abolition was baked into the founding of that denomination, yep. Which is, of course, the biggest white evangelical denomination to this day, even though it's been losing members. So I didn't know all of that history. And I didn't, to your point, understand the ways that income and neighborhoods, shape who we know and what we see of the world. But I will say, there was at least lip service in my church growing up to the desire to be more racially integrated and more diverse. But one of the things I write about in the chapter called Leave Loud is the fact that, a lot of churches in the 90s were doing that and talking about that, and many still are. But, in talking with a number of Black Christians in particular who've spent time in those spaces, many of them have said, it's one thing to hire a Black pastor and put them on your roster, and it's another thing to really center the experiences of Black people and other people of color and have that shape, not just who's on your website, but who's sort of making decisions and shaping the way, the issues that the church values and prioritizes.
Yeah, as I was sitting here, as you were talking, I thought about Pastor Tony Evans, who chose to align with the Bible Fellowship, and what happens when he comes to Dallas and he's attending these different churches. Basically, the white folks tell him, you need to go start your own. And so when you talk about Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship was born out of racism because he was rejected by these white churches in Dallas. That's just a reality. So when you talk about this experience for African Americans, you often hear the phrase that white Christianity is slaveholder religion, and I think one of the things that is difficult, again, and this has been going on for decades and in centuries here, is that you've had little introspection. People, and many white evangelicals not really confronting the reality of being a Christian and also the reality of whiteness and Jim Crow and how Jim Crow was driven for 92 years largely by the church. And had the white church had there been more John Browns, had there been more white abolitionists, then frankly, Jim Crow could have ended a hell of a lot sooner if white Christians had truly believed in the Bible and the Jesus they say they did.
Well, I think this is a really important point, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the idea that people to kind of make Jesus into whatever they want him to be very often. I, growing up, heard a lot about the role of Christians in the anti-slavery movement. I heard a lot about the role of Christians in the resistance to the Nazis. We didn't talk at all about the role of white Christians in perpetuating and endorsing and promoting slavery. We didn't talk at all about the role of the German church in platforming and accepting Hitler, or the Catholic Church, right, in turning a blind eye in many cases. We just talked about the Christians who did the right thing, but we didn't talk about the Christians who did the wrong thing.
Right, and that is so American. That is so American, how we love to talk about the good stuff, but we never want to deal with the bad stuff because that's just too painful and messy.
No, it's because it's uncomfortable. And I think because talking about the good guys, it advances the narrative. It lets us pat ourselves on the back and say we're on the good team, the side of the righteousness. And, any of those Christians who did the wrong thing, yeah, they existed, but they weren't true Christians, right? That's sort of the easy, sort of lazy, I think, response. I think for a Christian, for a person of faith, I think a much more thoughtful and productive and honest response is to look at all of it and to I think, reflect on the fact that many, many people over human history have claimed to be people of faith, people of God, and have still done the wrong thing. And, I went to an evangelical college, and I think one of the most important things, one of the most memorable things that one of my professors told us, my philosophy professor, was we were talking, I believe it was about the civil rights movement and the history of slavery and racism and racial justice. And he said to us in this classroom, full of evangelical kids, mostly white evangelical kids, he said, we can all look back and we can see that that was wrong. But what is it in our midst today that we are endorsing and participating in that's just as wrong, that we don't even see? And I was just stunned by that. It really stuck with me,
Absolutely. You write a lot about Bob Jones University in the book. And for people who don't understand presidential politics, who don't understand the white evangelical movement, Bob Jones University was has been a critical player in the rise of white evangelicals in politics.
Yeah, this history is a little before my time, but I think there's a history there, right, of hosting Republican presidential candidates. I think that position has maybe kind of been taken more by Liberty University in more recent years, but I think it played kind of a similar role. Is that fair?
Yeah. Prior to the rise of Liberty, it was mandatory for Republican candidates to make a pit stop at Bob Jones University. And it was, I remember when George W. Bush was running in 2000, and even then it was an issue because for the longest, Bob Jones University practiced Jim Crow, barred interracial dating. Right. And and again, and Republicans and white evangelicals lauded Bob Jones University for its focus on Christianity, but didn't really want to talk about its racism.
Yeah. And, I do know that the clash between Bob Jones and the IRS over civil rights rules that were going to require Bob Jones to be integrated and allow, for example, interracial dating, which they didn't for a very long time. That clash, historians like Randall Ballmer have argued, gave birth in many ways to the current religious right, to groups like the moral majority, who were sort of built on the backlash to that policy. Of course, that began to encompass many other issues, including abortion and same-sex marriage and so forth. But you make an important point. I mean, schools like Bob Jones, which again have a fairly recent history of segregation, have been, instrumental to the political process in the past. Again, that's something that they ultimately reversed that policy, but it was in place for a long time, and it led to a court fight with the IRS.
Right, and the point there, them having to reverse the policy, they were forced to do so. Right. They chose racism. They chose to be racially segregated. And then by doing so, what they were doing is they were saying to other white evangelicals, this is okay. This is the way forward. And folks embraced that and were silent in telling them, this is wrong. This is not the way of Jesus.
Right. And one of the things that I trace in the book, too, is the fact that a lot of the textbooks that were, widely used in Christian schools like mine and by homeschoolers came from Bob Jones and also from the Abeka books, which were out of Pensacola University, both, white Southern universities. I don't think Pensacola had the exact same history as Bob Jones, but, I document in the book some of the texts that we were taught just, as fact. They were just kind of the atmosphere, the air we breathed. At best glossed over some of the ugly history of the, treatment of the indigenous people or the history of slavery. And in some cases, much worse. I mean, I quote a couple passages that going back to them this many years later, I was kind of shocked at just how egregious they were in terms of, talking about, one of them, and I can't remember if it was a Bob Jones text or an Abeka text, but it's cited in the book. One of them talked about, the South having warm air and slaves staying healthy, and I mean, this was in a Christian school textbook that was being taught to young white Christian kids. And again, I think if you had asked my parents, they would have said, yeah, that's actually really bad, but the fact that it was kind of just part of the culture in such a way that it didn't raise huge red flags, I think says a lot.
Yep. Well, again, silence sometimes is even more powerful than the loudest voices championing certain things. There's a chapter in your book called A Virtuous Woman, and it's perfect that we're having this conversation right now because Kansas City Chiefs kicker Harrison Butker recently delivered his commencement speech at a Catholic college that has gotten lots of attention. His speech was condemned by the NFL, a lot of other people as well. And so before I really get into it, I just got to get your take on that, because what you're laying out here, if people think, oh, that stuff is just so old. Nope, that was just last week.
I know. He's a Kansas City Chief. That's my hometown, although the speech wasn't in my hometown, but it was somewhere in Kansas, I think, Benedictine College. Catholic college, not an evangelical college, but I think there's some cultural overlap there. And yes, right, he said he addressed the women who were just getting their college degree and essentially warned them against being too ambitious in their careers and seeking promotions instead of prioritizing their families. And there is a chapter in my book, as you said, where I talk about being told something very similar. This was more than 20 years ago when I graduated from college. And the mother of one of my male friends, I'm sitting in the cafeteria, she's visiting, I'm sitting there with my friend who wanted to go to medical school. I, at the time, was thinking about going to law school. And we said so. And she said, don't do that. That'll take you away from your families. Now, neither of us, by the way, were even engaged at this point. So this was like a hypothetical family, not that it would have been okay if we were. but yes, that mentality, I was kind of aghast and also just kind of sad to see that it's still out there. There is this trope that women have to choose between really, we can't be our whole selves. We have to choose either a family or a career. And I thought,
we literally called it a vocation.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, like, I'm a mother. I have 2 wonderful teenage boys. I'm also a wife. I love those roles. I'm grateful for those roles. They are more meaningful to me than my career. I'll say that. Maybe that's regressive, but I think a lot of men would say, yeah, my family is more meaningful to me than anything else. There's nothing wrong with any person of any gender feeling that way. But to pretend like it's somehow uniquely a woman's job to do those things, and if you don't have those things, your life is going to be, empty and you're going to regret your career. I mean, it's so insulting and so offensive on so many levels. And, a couple of things. Men are not asked to make these choices, first of all. Second, not all women have these choices. And I think that the entire conversation about, traditional wife versus career woman, whatever, it's an incredibly privileged conversation, because the reality is, in this day and age, most women don't have a choice to stay home. And most people, their career, if you're lucky, your career is something that you get fulfillment out of. But a career is fundamentally a way to pay the bills, right? First and foremost, for most of us, unless you have a lot of privilege.
His own mama did.
Right.
I mean, the dude's mom is a physicist. She's a clinical medical physicist at Emory University.
I saw that.
What the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, it's so much privilege. It's such a place of privilege.
But see, for the people who don't understand, and I'm telling you, but people are not understanding what's happening right now. When you look at the debates over the issue of abortion, reproductive rights, great replacement theory, this white fear. I'm talking about in my book, White Fear. I call it White Fear: How the Browning of America is Making White Folks Lose Their Minds. What you have is, in the white evangelical space, embodied by Speaker Mike Johnson, is this worldview that white America has been destroyed because how dare you white women go off and get degrees? How dare you go off and get jobs and sacrifice birthing babies and being wives? And they are, it literally came up in the Dobbs decision in Amy Coney Barrett in the questioning and the writing. And people have to realize that what he spoke about, that worldview is literally being touted in high political spaces because that's being spoken and that's being driven. And I don't think people understand how pervasive it is today in 2024 as compared to what you talked about when you were in school.
I think one of the most compelling comments I saw on this was, I can't remember the woman's name. I wish, I'm not going to try, but on Twitter, there was this long thread, which I retweeted on X, in which she essentially argues that when you pretend like a woman's natural vocation or space is home and children, and that's just what she should be doing, and that's just what she wants to do, well, then you kind of erase the fact that that is work, and that is something that we all need to recognize as a society is work that needs to be attended to, compensated, planned for. And I think that's a really important point, because, if we assume that there is a woman at home taking care of everything, well, that makes a lot of people's lives a lot easier. And it also makes women easier to control. But, that's not the world we live in anymore.
It's not the world that we live in, but it's there. It's there. And so what happens? I think
there are those who want us to live in it again. Yes.
Yeah. And the thing is, they hold public office. And so what they're doing is they literally are taking those worldviews and applying it to public policy. And we're seeing the impact, especially in states, red states, where Republicans have super majorities. And so people need to understand that what you're laying out, this is not some old worldview, and we'll look at this from a historical standpoint. There are folks who literally are trying to make this public policy agenda today.
I don't think it's what most people want, though. If you look at
right,
I know it's not. If you look at polling, I mean, and I don't think it's even what most Republican women want. But there is a group of people that would like to go back to a society that's structured in that way.
So explain that, though. Explain, because this is the thing, and you just hit on something that we talked a lot about in 2016, where you look at these studies and you look at these polls and you see the percentage of women when it comes to the issue of choice, even when Republican women come in. You talk about Plan B. You could talk about, we could talk about all kinds of different numbers. And look at the polling numbers. But when it's time to vote, 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump in 2016. It increased to 55% in 2020. And white evangelicals, that's his strongest base. So the question then becomes, for these white evangelical women, these white conservative women, what is it where they have a position that is the same as progressives, but they're voting differently, and these are significant issues?
Well, I mean, polling indicates that, until the last few years, most people didn't list abortion as a priority voting issue. People across the spectrum listed issues like the economy and immigration, and that was true to a fairly bipartisan degree. Now, we've seen since the Dobbs decision, we've seen a shift among Democratic women and also younger voters and voters of color, who are now listing abortion as a much higher priority, top one or two issues for those groups. But I don't think it's as high of a priority for Republican women. They're looking at other issues. I think they're more concerned about, at least from having been on the campaign trail in New Hampshire and Iowa, I heard a lot about issues like the border security, immigration, a lot of fear about what was happening there, concerns about international politics or global affairs, since that, there's a lot, it's sort of a scary, dangerous world, and a desire to be protected. I heard that kind of thing. And certainly the economy. And so, why do some women prioritize abortion and others don't? I'm not sure I can answer that, but I think, historically, it wasn't even an issue that Democratic women prioritized in the same way until the Supreme Court decision. So there's been a big shift, and I think that will have an impact. It's had an impact in the last couple of elections. How much of an impact it will have in November, I don't know, because again, voters are thinking about a lot of different issues.
Yep. You're a political correspondent with NPR, and I'm trying to think, Peggy Waymeyer, who used to be with WFAA in Dallas, was hired as the religion correspondent for ABC News when Peter Jennings was the anchor. When I was at CNN, we had a religion correspondent. I remember there was a black woman who was at Fox News. When I was at the Fort Worth Star Telegram, we had a religion writer. But when you look at media today, I think part of the issue problem for me is that in media, they have no clue what the hell happens in religious spaces. Many people write about religion from an antagonistic point of view, and you don't have. And then what happens is, if you do see religion conversations, it is oftentimes completely driven by white evangelicals. That was the case when I was at CNN. I was there for 6 years, and it was always stunning to me to have, I forgot the guy, was it Donahue? He was over the Catholic League. He was always on. They always turned to Tony Perkins. And I used to always go, y'all know there's some other people we can book to talk about politics and religion. And I used to get into these debates with both of them, and I would give Tony Perkins fits because I would say, oh, Tony, you happen to run up against a black person who knows the Bible just as well as you. And that was all it was. But it was interesting to me watching how producers and editors really had no clue about how to cover religion. And I think part of the problem that we are facing today is that media wants to run from it as opposed to lean in, when religion is a significant part of American society. Your perspective on, do you sort of have the same views I do of how media, frankly, has failed in many ways to properly cover religion in this country?
I think it's gotten better over the course of my career. I mean, I can point to, a number of writers that I think do a really good job. I think, Elizabeth Diaz at the New York Times and Ruth Graham at the New York Times, Emma Green, who's been a writer for The Atlantic and other publications. There are a lot of those are all white women. Sorry about that. And I know them all, and I think and I kind of know them professionally, but I think they're all really excellent reporters, and many of, at least a couple of them have a faith background. And I think that helps. I think we need a diverse array of religion writers from a variety of backgrounds. And I think groups like the Religion News Service have done a really good job of elevating the conversation, and I know hiring, a diverse range of writers to write about the intersection between culture and politics and religion. But I think you're right. I mean, religion, oh my gosh, for religious people, which is still a lot of this country, even with the decline in religiosity, and even people who are unaffiliated, many of them have a religious context or a family context. But religion shapes so many things. It overlays with culture in such important ways, and it shapes the language with which we talk about the most important issues around, values and priorities and how to live life. And so, I think you're right. I think that there have been historically a lot of people in the national press who haven't really understood that, or understood how to cover it, or understood what, religion looks like in small towns and rural areas and outside the Beltway. How much it drives people.
They don't even cover religion in large cities.
True. True.
When I was at KRLD Radio in Dallas, I'll never forget. There was a Bishop T.D. Jakes. They had a massive conference, and I went to the news director, who was Jack Hines. They had no idea who the hell he was. Mm. And I literally said to them, I said, wait a minute. Every time, I think it was First Baptist, I forgot, he was a major force in the white evangelical community, to the Baptist Convention. And every time, if he showed up on Sunday, he had been ill or whatever, they would do a story. I said, I swear, y'all cover that white man at First Baptist on everything he does. I said, you got a guy in South Dallas who's talking to 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people every weekend, who's known across the world. They literally had no clue who Bishop T.D. Jakes was. Yeah. Yeah. And I was like, what the hell? It was stunning to me that here we are, the biggest news station, the biggest news radio station in Dallas, Fort Worth. And when I mentioned Bishop T.D. Jakes, they were kind of like, huh?
I think there's some of it may also be cultural. I think in the Northeast, in the sort of kind of waspy circles that a lot of people in the press come from or work in, there's like a politeness about, you don't talk about religion, right? It's a private thing. And that's not as true in, certainly in the Midwest and South, where I spent a lot of my life before coming to Washington. That's not true for everybody, but I think it's sort of the culture of a lot of the, of newsrooms for sure. And understandably, right? Because people want to be objective and fair. But I think that what's lost is failing to sort of see this layer, this really important layer of life that shapes so much of life for so many people. I do think that for lack of a better term, the religious left or progressive religious groups have started to understand that more in recent years. And I've covered some of those efforts, and I've seen those efforts, to to try to promote a dialogue around religion that isn't just focused on white evangelicals, and that is, more comprehensive and robust, and that injects into the conversation the fact that, values mean a lot of things to a lot of different things to different people, but there's not just one voice on that.
In writing your book, and after it was published, what have the conversations been like for people who you grew up with, went to school with, work with? Have they come to you and said, I had no damn idea this was going on? Have you opened a lot of their eyes to what they literally went through, but never really saw or understood?
I have heard from a number of people, some of whom I know and some whom I don't know, who have said that reading the book really helped clarify things for them, help them understand the white evangelical culture. These are people who are sort of outside of it. I've heard from a lot of people, and this would be the biggest group, who have some experience with the white evangelical subculture, some of whom I knew growing up, and many who I did not know growing up, who've said essentially, thank you for articulating something for me. Like, thank you for pulling this all together and describing both what this experience is like for so many people in the evangelical subculture, and also kind of, how it came to be and how it affects where we are today. Because, the book is part memoir, but it's also a lot of interviews with a lot of other former evangelicals about their experiences and their sort of wrestling with their faith and the culture of white evangelicalism. And then I pull in a lot of research, a lot of data, and primary source research from some of the textbooks and so forth that I mentioned. And, so it's been really gratifying to hear from people from a variety of perspectives and experiences who've all said essentially, like, this book explains so much. And I think I'm most pleased when I hear from people who feel like it validates and describes their own experience, because I wrote the book in large part because I knew that my experience was not unusual, and it was one that not everybody had insight into. But to hear that feedback coming in now that the book is out in the world, it's just been really, really wonderful.
And are you also hopeful that you're going to see a generation of white evangelicals, young evangelicals, who are challenging old precepts, who are going to bring in, if you will, or ring in a new perspective, as opposed to what we're seeing, the desperation to hold on to the old worldview of white evangelicals? Because I think that's really what this friction is. I've long said, and you talked about George Floyd in the aftermath of his murder in the book, and here we are 4 years after that happened. What I've said is that white America got really freaked out because, one, for the first time in American history, a black movement, a majority of Americans approved of it. That has never happened in American history. I think it was like 53 or 55%. That has never happened. Two, what freaked a lot of these folks out is there were young white people who were protesting, who were angry about what happened. And I think it has freaked out a lot of those folks. And what I just believe is that what we're seeing is, in which I talked about in my book, White Fear, this desperate attempt to hold on to that old world as long as possible. And I just believe that they're trying to drive it in public policy, in textbooks, the whole stripping away different content and banning books and all these different things. And so it's a desperation to hold on to that old world as much as possible. Do you see young white evangelicals saying, no, there has to be, we've got to move into the 21st century and recognize that old Jim Crow religion simply cannot be sustained in the 21st century?
Certainly some of the ones I talk to and the people who are finding themselves in these exvangelical spaces are questioning a lot of these concerns, raising a lot of these concerns. I talked to people who were very disturbed by, I mean, how could you not be, by what they saw with the police killing of George Floyd, and also were disturbed by their church's response to it, or what felt like an inadequate response. I talked to both Black Christians and white Christians who had that sentiment. So I think you're seeing some of that, and you know, also a desire to see more equality, you know, for women, for LGBTQ people. I think all of those factors are motivating a lot of self-reflection and change. And so, no, I think that the younger generation does see things differently. Where that goes, ultimately, I don't know. But what's really clear is that we're in the midst of a lot of religious change in this country. You know, a lot of people don't want to be affiliated with religious institutions for a whole variety of reasons. And I think that means potentially, you know, a lot of social and cultural change too.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, I've been saying, even to the Democrats, listen, your old way of trying to campaign by just hitting the Black churches in September and October, that's gone, because what we're seeing is, and this is where the church, whether you're white evangelical, you're Black evangelical, whatever you want to call yourself, has to now contend with, is that people have been so rubbed wrong by people's views when it comes to church that they're opting not to even go to church. And we're seeing attendance down. We're seeing all of those different things. And it has to me, it has to force a real look in the mirror to say, what will constitute the church in 10, 15, 20 years if things continue the way they are now?
Yeah. You know, I think one of the most interesting data points in the latest Public Religion Research Institute survey about disaffiliation, about people leaving religion, was that a significant number of people who left churches said that they had to leave because of their mental health. It wasn't a good place for their mental health. And that was particularly pronounced among people who left white evangelical churches, but not exclusive to them.
Listen, my parents were attending a predominantly white church. Well, actually, it was a very much racially diverse church in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And they were like, no, we had to leave because they could not tolerate the hardcore right-wing MAGA perspective coming from the pulpit. My brother, same thing, a church in Houston. And I've heard that from a lot of different people. They're like, yo, I'm not trying to hear that. If you want to support Trump, you want to support the right way, they're like, but don't make that the dominant worldview coming out of that pulpit.
Yeah. And you know, what's driving that sense of church not being a good place for mental health? Exactly. I don't know. That this survey didn't speak to that, but I think it's really telling. And it's concerning too, because historically, a lot of people, I mean, anecdotally, I know a lot of people who started going to church when they were going through a hard time in their life. And it was a place where they could find support and community. And so, you know, I think that presents it would be nice to think that there would still be those places where people could find support and community, but be included, accepted, feel like it's a positive thing.
Last question for you. I asked this of every book author I talked to. What was your wow moment when researching or writing this book? Was there that one or two things where you even went, wow?
Well, like I said, it's not a good wow, but going back to some of my old textbooks, I tried to, as much as I could, reconstruct the textbooks I'd had in my own schools. So I did that by going to used book sites and kind of looking at the covers and then trying to order, approximately the same year. Now, I wouldn't swear to it that these are the right ones, but a lot of them I'm pretty sure. And they were definitely the publishers we used from approximately the same time periods. And so just looking back at some of that text and seeing the way that some of these Christian school textbooks talked about race and talked about women was pretty stunning. And, but it also, it made me glad that I'd gone back and done it, because originally when I started writing the book, it was going to be mostly memoir and interviews. And I thought, some of the stuff that I remember, I don't want people to take my word for it, that it was this way. I want them to hear it from the horse's mouth. So that's when I went and started pulling all the primary sources,
There you go. You're like, this ain't opinion, this fact.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not like you said, you can read some of the stuff about like the way that women are talked about, and somebody could be like, really, is that how it is? Is that really what people said? Well, it is. And it's still being said, to your point. It's still being said.
Absolutely. Loving, living, and leaving the white evangelical church, the Exvangelicals. Sarah McCammon, will appreciate you being on the Black Star Network. Thanks a bunch.
Thanks so much. It's good to talk to you, Roland.
Fanbase is pioneering a new era of social media for the creator economy. This next generation social media app with over 600,000 users is raising $17 million, and now is your chance to invest. For details on how to invest, visit startengine.com/fanbase or scan the QR code. Another way we're giving you the freedom to be you without limits.